Represent. Yo, what's up? Ayan na. Kamusta kayo dyan, mga kameta? From YouTube to Facebook, ang mga kabardagulan. Kamusta kayo dyan? Kamusta kayo dyan? Happy Labor Day, of course. Pag-usapan natin ng labor, no? Let's talk more about it. Medyo parang British ating spelling ng labor nilagay natin, no? OU. Balikan natin yan. But first of all, of course, mga kameta, alam ko yung marami sa inyo nakabantay dito sa meta natin kasi akala nyo magbardagulan tayo in the way that you expected. Grabe, na-clarify lang tayo over the weekend yung context ng article natin ng Nikkei Asia. Mukhang marami na trigger dyan kung ano sinasabi tapos ako pang akusahin na triggered. Next thing I know over the weekend, naka-sampung tinatag-tag ako ng mga ano dyan, mga alam nyo na, mga marites dyan. Next thing I know, pagdating sa YouTube, ginagawa na ng issue ng mga ano natin dyan, mga ex-Malacanang vloggers dyan. Sabi ko, naku, mukhang kailangan ng traffic tong mga to ah. Sige lang, sige lang. Tapos ako pa yung triggered. Alam mo yan. Hindi, syempre mga kameta, alam niyo naman pag Sabbath day on Sunday, hindi ako pumapatal sa social media, ayaw ko makipag-away, so hindi na ako sumagot. Pero kanina sabi ko, let's just, say something about it. Baka naman, pansinin niyo naman guys, pansinin niyo naman itong mga Malacanang vloggers. Booyaka siya! Kumusta kayo dyan? Talaga mga kameta, pansin ko talaga na tuwan-tuwa talaga kayo. Go na go kayo pag bardagulan ang nangyari. Alright, now, as much as I want to do more bardagulan, as much as gusto kong put in the right place yung mga ibang ano dyan, never mind na. Let's talk about something a bit more serious mga kameta. Sige, sige. Kahit, for me, hindi naman mahalaga na views lang parate. Minsan, million yung views ng mga FB Live natin. Minsan, hindi. Mga 3,000, 10,000, 20,000, ganun. Para sa atin naman mga kameta, ang basyan ng ang basyan ng value ng ginagawa natin is yung quality ng content na nilalagay natin diyan. Na gusto na iba na Made in Marites or Malacanang Vlogger Edition, bala sila dyan. But here mga kameta, whatever is the view number, we'll try to do our best to shed light on the most important issues uh, affecting our country and of course affecting our world, no? Yun ang gagawin natin today. So kung disappointed kayo na ayaw namin magbardugulan all the way, bahala kayo dyan. You can watch the trashy ones out there, marami po sila. But here today, let me talk about something more serious mga kameta, no? And that's in the context of the Labor Day today. Now, so what I'm gonna do today mga kameta is I'm gonna show a number of data, graphs, numbers that reflect to you gaano kalaki nung kahalagaan ng contribution ng mga manggagawa sa ating ekonomiya. Both domestically, dito sa Pilipinas, yung mga nandito residents sa Pilipinas, but also yung mga ating mga modern day heroes, yung mga kapatid na overseas Filipino workers sa iba't ibang panig ng mundo, no? So, pag-usapan natin yung mga kameta. Let's look at the numbers, let's look at the data. The reason why I wanted to really go deep into this issue is because pansin ko talaga mga kameta, pagdating sa Pilipinas, I think we have the tendency to over-glorify mga tycoon, mayaman sa Pilipinas, sinong pinakamalaking bilyonaryo. We tend to pay a lot of attention to that, but we don't pay as much attention to actually the real heroes of the Philippine economy. And I'll show you why I call the other people actually the real heroes. Like, good dun sa mga tycoons and billionaires, a lot of them are making a lot of easy money because of monopolistic practices, because they're, alam na natin yung kalakaran dyan, di ba? We'll talk more about this. But the real heroes of the Philippine economy actually yung ating mga manggagawa, both dito sa Pilipinas at saka yung mga OFWs natin. In fact, on many, many occasions mga kameta, kawawa yung Philippine economy if not dun sa mga remittances na pinadala ng ating mga kapatid, no? From all across the world. So malaki po ang contribution ng mga manggagawang Pilipino sa stabilidad at sa kaunlaran ng ating bansa. Even if maliit lang yung level of growth natin minsan, even if yung per capita income natin ay napakababa, no? So, I think there's really major problem here dito sa Pilipinas na parati narinig natin na, oh, ang Pinoy kasi ganito, ganyan, pasaway, ganyan. Parati may victim blaming, parati may gaslighting, parati may Karens dyan, Karenism dyan, no? But mga kameta, in fact, if you look at the real numbers, you look at serious studies, it shows you that much of the productivity and growth that is in the Philippines is because of dun sa, not necessarily mga tycoons natin, oligarchs, but it's actually because of yung ating mga ordinaryong manggagawa. Especially though yung mga nagsusulat sa mga international, ay yung mga nag-work sa international companies, multinational companies, especially yung mga ating mga OFWs, especially mga middle class natin na napakalaki yung kanilang buwis, no? At contribution dun sa coffers of the government who don't have as many tax breaks as some of the billionaires out there. So, pag-usapan natin yan mga kameta, and let's look at the numbers. Now, kanina umaga nakita natin na ang laki ng rally, no? Nagra-rally yung mga labor groups dito sa Pilipinas, si Calyodi na interview kanina sa ABS-CBN, among others. And in fairness, medyo malaki yung rally, no? Kung sana lang, ano, may drone tayo mga kameta. Ito, nag-check na ako ng drone talaga eh. Kailangan natin mag-drone eh. Sige, kahit made in China, itong DJI na yan. Nag-check ako ng drone actually kasi minsan maganda gumawa ng vlogs tapos nagde-drone ka talaga para makita mo yung ano. Pang drone talaga yung nangyari ka Meta kanina, no? Itong rally ng mga labor groups sa Pilipinas at ang init kanina mga kameta. What was it? 36, 37 degrees but with the humidity lampas sa 40 degrees, 40 degrees, no? Celsius yung init kanina. Grabe. Pero marami nandun, daming tao mga kameta. Tignan yung mga pictures, yung mga videos na lumalabas. At of course, ang demand ng ating mga manggagawa is fundamentally more dignified working conditions, more security of tenure. Hindi yung wala pang 6 months, i-renew mo naman sila para wala silang 13 month, para wala silang mga benepisyo. All kind of exploitative labor practices dyan that allows a lot of people, a lot of tycoons to make a lot of money, but is actually not helping yung purchasing power, economic security, welfare, healthcare ng marami sa ating mga kababayan. So yun yung mga kailangan natin pag-usapan mga kameta, no? So let's look at the numbers, no? So if you look at it in Southeast Asian region and Southeast Asian in particular mga kameta, billionaires tend to do very well regardless of how the economy is doing, no? Before Asian financial crisis, after Asian financial crisis, andun pa rin yung mga bilyonaryo. Before pandemic, after pandemic, because that's what happens when you have monopolistic protectionist economy, no? That's what happens when there's a monopoly also on access to finance and capital. So clearly nakita natin na, and not to mention bailout kasi too big to fail yung maraming mga oligarchs and conglomerates dyan, no? Unlike in other more advanced countries talaga, kung may downturn, makikita natin yung mga underperforming na or hindi masyadong productive na mga companies or mga, not to yung conglomerates is more of an Asian thing. We don't see much of that actually in the West, no, or more developed economies, no. But anyway, let's look at some of the numbers mga kameta para ma-appreciate niyan. The reason I'm doing this mga kameta is because alam ko dito sa ating bayan, there's a tendency sometimes na hindi ma-appreciate yung contribution natin manggagawa. Hindi ma-appreciate yung value ng mga protests or rallies which have very legitimate basis and are part and parcel of having actually vibrant democracy. Yan, may mga trolls tayo dyan, na galit na naman sa facts natin. Well, let me post this new facts in your face, you know? Lalo yung mga hindi nag-research dyan. Alright? Ayan yung mga, alam niyo na, mga henyo dyan, na walang ayaw mag-research, ayaw makinig dun sa mga nag-research, gusto pa rin hanggang bardagulan lang. So let me show you some numbers mga kameta for you to appreciate what we're saying. So these are the numbers I got from this fascinating book, Asia's Godfathers by Joe Studwell. If you remember mga kameta, na-mention natin yan in some of our earlier vlogs where I tried to explain why Vietnam, for instance, has been moving towards developing high-end, more industrial, manufacturing-driven conglomerates like the Vin groups, while in other countries, guess what? Hanggang mga real estate, hanggang mga, alam niyo na, mga retail, mga ganyan na lang, di ba? Walang masyadong global manufacturing, high-tech, global brand kind of development na nangyari sa atin, no? Now, I also mentioned Joe Studwell in context of when I was discussing how Asia works, yung book niya on How Asia Works, which look at the role of industrial and trade policy, mga kameta. So, balikan niyo yan, mga vlogs na yan. I'll also post sa baba yung link sa books and all para ma-appreciate niyo yan. Now, going back to this mga kameta, there are a number of very interesting graphs that he showed that. Now, this book is, not over the past 5 years or so, but a lot of fundamental arguments it makes are still valid in many ways if you actually triangulate them with latest numbers. Now, speaking of facts, let's bring out some graphs and data, lalo dun sa mga henyo dyan, na troll dyan, na walang appreciation ng data. So, one way that, one way to understand bakit ang laki ng contribution ng ating manggagawa, especially yung mga nagtatrabaho sa export-oriented industries that tend to be actually multinational companies, semiconductor companies, Japanese companies, American companies, textile companies, yung mga base sa Philippines sa export zone. One of the things that you have to look at, mga kameta, is the close correlation between economic growth, no, and actually export growth. That just tells you. So this is a very interesting graph. So this is a graph, mga kameta, of Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Hong Kong. Now this shows that actually from 1960s all the way to early 2000s, there's a very strong correlations between export growth and at the same time the economic growth rate. So you can see how important exports are to economic stability and economic prosperity in a lot of Southeast Asian countries. And speaking of exports, actually the most high value added exports or most important exports are actually not developed by domestic conglomerates in a lot of this economy, because a lot of their conglomerates don't really develop global brands in much of Southeast Asia. But actually, this is like assembly lines for the Toyotas, Nissans, and BMWs. This is about textile factories for Adidas and Nike and all of those brands. And maraming nagtatrabaho dyan yung mga ordinaryong Pilipino, and then multinational companies yung nag-invest dyan. So very close correlation. Now, to make you guys appreciate why this is peculiar, look at, for instance, the case of a more developed and diversified economy like the United States. And you can see that the export and growth are not as correlated, because in these countries, growth is driven by productivity increases by domestic companies, no? Nasaan yan? Ito for instance. So this is the US case. This sa taas is the Southeast Asia case. You can see in the US case, for instance, there are times na growth is very high, exports is not that high. There are times that growth is quite high, or there are times that exports are pretty decent, but growth levels are not necessarily. So the correlation between the two is very, very limited compared to what we see in much of Southeast Asian countries. So doon mo mahita what is the real contributor to growth and productivity increase. Now, let me show you another graph that shows how low the contribution. Another graph that shows you how low is the quality and value of domestic investment made, especially by a lot of conglomerates and oligarchs in a lot of Southeast Asian countries. So this is another one, and you can see the Philippines is actually the lowest here. So this is an interesting graph also. So here, mga kameta, this is dun sa graph makikita nyo, yung level of domestic capital investments, no? By, of course, sino hawak ng pinakamalaking capital sa mga bansang, alam natin. Now, if you look at it, actually the Philippines has really low levels of domestic investments, no? And it's actually way below the crude average, no? So if you average the investment by conglomerates and oligarchs in different Southeast Asian countries, or tycoons in different South, Philippines is way below the average, right? So there's not much of domestic investment important happening. And why is domestic investment important? Because, Kameta, if you want to increase your productivity, if you want to create better brand products, if you want to get more and more out of 1 hour of work, you have to invest dun sa technology. You have to invest dun sa kakayan ng mga pabrika mo. You have to invest in research and development. And that's what we see, for instance, in great countries like South Korea, no? When there's high levels of research and development by their chaebols, so may pagka-tycoons, oligarchs din sila, yung tinatawag na chaebols, Samsung, Hyundai, etc. But they invest a lot domestically. They have global brands. They export from their own domestic conglomerates. Their domestic conglomerates improve a lot of productivity of their laborers. They pay their laborers pretty decently, right? They invest a lot in new technologies and all. And if you look at it in the Philippines, even compared to our Southeast Asian countries, super low levels of domestic investments ang nangyari. So if you look at it, really, when you put a lot of these numbers together, there are more graphs that I can show you guys. And I suggest you guys read the book, among other books. So another book I'll suggest to you guys to also appreciate na why this is anomalous, that there's not much domestic investments, because actually, if you look at the Philippines, a lot of our tycoons have had very easy access to domestic capital. And a lot of them actually, mga kameta, have their own banks. Banks where your money goes, our savings goes to it. Banks that benefit from remittances coming in from abroad, no? At may kaltas na naman yan. Banks that have a lot of access to, bailout just in case if things go wrong because they're too big to fail, no? So this is the context we're talking about the other day. Although it was critical of the history of the Philippine National Bank in the 1916 to 19. If you look at the Philippines, this is a fascinating book by Paul Hodge of Australian National University. When he looks at how tycoons essentially dominated the banking sector in the Philippines. So they're the ones who can easily have access to capital. Good luck sa mga ordinary or small and medium enterprises and businesses to get big loan. Ang hirap kumuha ng loan, di ba? So and you know where the money of the banks come from. Like a lot of them is from ordinary people. Their savings go there, right? And one of the interesting things that actually Joe Studwell talks about is how low is the investments in equity markets or stock markets in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines. So much of the savings, instead of going to equity markets, stock markets, and to push companies to be more productive, to build their brand, to be more and more competitive. No, no, no. A lot of investments goes into banks that, by the way, a lot of these banks tend to be also owned by, in one way or another, they tend to be affiliated with some conglomerate and really began. Now, if some folks bother to actually look at the facts and data, the phenomenon is not a Dilawan kind of invention. This actually really took off during the martial law period. We're looking at the 1970s. Now, on one hand, there was the push factor, and on the other one, there was a pull factor. The pull factor, of course, mga kameta, was the boom in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, which were having petrodollars injected their economy. They wanted to build infrastructure. They wanted to create better healthcare systems. So there was a lot of demand for foreign workers. But more importantly, a lot of Filipino professionals were moving to the United States and abroad by the 1960s already. But more and more moved into the West. But a lot of others, not necessarily from the middle class, were moving to the Middle East, moving to Malaysia, moving to Hong Kong, many parts of the world, many developing parts of the world, not so rich parts of the world, because there was no jobs available at home. Because conditions at home were extremely, extremely unhelpful as far as employment and poverty and all is concerned. I'm not talking about mga nonsense. I'm not talking about the nonsensical propaganda, yung mga ek-ek dyan. I'm talking about the actual numbers. No? So you look at it for the red is the Marcos here. So there's a lot of high growth rates, but there's also huge drops and recessions towards the end. What's interesting to know is actually a lot of the high growth rates initially that were created were also based on debt, utang. So these were kind of like an unsustainable artificial growth. So even the growth years were kind of questionable. Although of course there was the oil crisis, etc. But the fact of the matter is, by the 1980s, early 1980s, the Philippine economy had already collapsed. No? So when people want to talk about why marami sa ating kababayan nagtatrabaho sa abroad, bakit na institutionalize na ito? Pag tinignan mo talagang kasaysayan na yun, we're talking about 70s, we're talking about 80s really as a takeoff point, right? And why? Because during the time the Philippine economy was not doing well. In terms of debt levels, total economic collapse by early 1980s, decline in growth rates, unsustainable growth rates, so much corruption right and left. Again, if you look at the work of Booty Capitalism, for instance, by Paul Hodggrove, you'll appreciate how corrupt things were back in the day. Now, the unfortunate thing though is, mga kameta, hindi inayos nung mga sumunod kay Marcos. No? But the reality is, to blame yung mga contemporary president for everything that's go wrong, and then you forget about what they inherited back in the day, that also missing the point, no? Because there's something called the path dependency. I just want to bring this out. No, so if you look at actually the remittances, one reason why the Philippines has been also able to weather really, really difficult conditions throughout the years and decades, from the 2007-8 financial crisis to to I'm trying to bring out this best numbers here, to the pandemic years, etc., is because steady parating mga remittances natin, no? Galing sa mga kababayan natin. So that provides also a lot of help to the country. So look at this, for instance. Look at how big are the remittances and how exponential they increase throughout the years from ating mga kababayan. So this is another major source of prosperity and wealth and economic stabilization for the Philippines. No remittances by ating kababayan. So even in the most difficult years, mga kameta, when economies were not doing well abroad, maraming employment insecurity in the West, still yung mga ating mga kabayan nagpapadala dito. Tinutulungan yung kanilang pamilya dito. Tinutulungan yung ating ekonomiya. Tinutulungan yung ating bansa. This is a very huge factor. Now, if magaling sana yung mga presidente natin noon pa, kung mahusay sana yung ating mga domestic companies, hindi kailangan umalis. Yung iba dyan, marami sa ating kababayang umalis, hindi dahil choice nila yan. Now, of course, some of us may choose to go abroad because it's even greener, right? But marami sa ating kababayan are moving abroad, going into very dangerous, very difficult conditions out of total desperations because the employment opportunities in the countries are very, very limited. And yet, what makes them extremely heroic, and dito talaga my heart goes to them, is because is that even when hindi maganda yung ekonomiya sa Saudi Arabia, for instance, let's say during the slump in the oil prices a decade ago, for instance, or like oil went from what $120 in 2013-14 to $30, for instance, yung nationalization, Saudization, or yung recession sa Europe, for instance, or recession sa US, still nagpapadala yung mga kababayan natin. So these are the real heroes. You know, the Filipino, yung mga manggagawa natin dito, especially mga nag-work sa export-oriented industries that tend to be multinational, foreign, Toyota, Nissan, Adidas, Nike, whatever, who are earning export earnings who are getting us export earnings. Kasi nakita natin sa graph, di ba? Very closely related yung export growth and GDP growth. So that's where really the productivity and boost is coming. But the other one is from outside. You have remittances coming in from our OFWs and all. And these are the two pillars of whatever prosperity we have in the country. And yet, our appreciation of yung contribution ng ating mga manggagawa is nowhere close to where it should be. We love to glorify our tycoons or whatever, right? Na how galing they are, how entrepreneurial they are. And I always say like, yeah, kung sobrang galing sila, ba't di sila naka-invento ng kahit isang sariling kotse? Like, where is the Filipino car brand? Or bakit wala tayong mga Samsung, may mga sarili tayong global brands? Why are not we developing high-end semiconductors? Diba? Wala eh. Walang technological innovation of any serious note over decade after decade after decade. Yung ibang conglomerate dyan, they have been here for what? Almost a century, right? And look at what happened. What have they produced? We don't even have global, like world-class banking. Banks, for instance, like HSBC that Hong Kong was able to develop, no? We don't even have Proton level of companies. Forget about VinFast level that Vietnam has been developing only over the past 5 years or so. At kung walang gyerang Vietnam, if Vietnam had chance to grow 30, 40 years ago, kung wala silang sanang yung war nung all this time, then siguro nag-develop na sila mga VinFast na 1980s, 1990s pa lang, di ba? So, yun yung sinasabi ko mga kameta eh. We do not appreciate the tremendous and profound contribution ng ating mga manggagawa, whether inside the Philippines and outside the Philippines, right? And why is the part is also why is it important? Because hindi minsan, well, not minsan, the tendency is underpaid yung mga ating laborers, no? Or even if the minimum wage may be high, okay, since sabi na, Philippines, mataas yung minimum wage. Yeah, but underemployment is also extremely high. Yung mga nire-renew na lang yung contract para walang bonuses, walang health benefits, etc. Walang tenure, masyadong mataas yun. So there's a lot of precarious proletariat dito sa Pilipinas. So that means that a lot of purchasing power we have in the Philippines is also driven because of the remittances coming from abroad, right? So this is really the truth of the Philippine political economy, mga kameta. Ganyan dapat natin i-analyze yung roots ng problema ng ating bansa pagdating sa lack of inclusive development. So if you look at mga kameta, let's look again at one of the biggest indicators of inequality. So as I said, only in the Philippines you see 70 to 80% of the Congress or legislature is political dynasties. Only in the Philippines you can see 40 families dominating 76% of newly created growth. These are the World Bank numbers. Let me show you another World Bank number. Gini coefficient, Philippines, World Bank. Now, this is interesting because in a separate podcast, si Lele Claudio was talking about, our good friend Lele Claudio was talking about fairness under Digong, medyo bumaba yung inequality levels natin in the pre-pandemic years. But the other week po nung nasa Vietnam tayo, at conference with our good friends from South Korea and from other Asian countries. And they were looking at, even at the most improved level, ang taas pa rin yung level of inequality natin mga kametan. No? So let me just give you a comparison of how unequal the Philippines is. So this is Gini coefficient, which measures between 1 to 0 how much is wealth concentrated in one person or properly spread across all different people. So the higher the number, the worse, right? So that's why crude na titignan mo lang GDP per capita in the Philippines, which by the way is still very low. Ang GDP per capita natin is like barely, I know it's lower middle income. It's not even upper middle income. But let me show you just some numbers here, mga kameta. Medyo hindi lang naglo-load na mabuti yan. Ba't siya hindi naglo-load? So in Vietnam, sorry, hindi ko alam, ayan, map. Di lumalabas yung line niya. Wait lang. So in the Vietnam, the numbers are 36.8. Sorry about that. Hindi ko malabas to para makita nyo. So in the Philippines, we're like 46.5, 46, 47.3 in 2006. No, yung Gini coefficient natin mga kametrong titignan nyo. In Vietnam, the number is way lower. It came as low as 34.8, right, in the mid 2010s. And then in South Korea, the numbers are, so as I said, the lower the number, the better. South Korea is not only way richer than the Philippines in per capita, but the distribution of the money is also way better. So so 31.4 is in Korea, one of the lowest numbers they have. Vietnam is also in the lower 30s or mid 30s at most. Philippines is in mid 40s. No? So the higher you go, the more unequal it is. Hindi ko na alam ba't di lumalabas itong line niya. Kasi gusto ko sana ipakita yung linya eh. Ay. Ang problema nito. Anyway, I'll post sa baba mga kametadong where you can check the links on your own para ma-appreciate nyo what is the Gini coefficient, what is it. What I'm saying is that it's not only that we're not having sustained growth throughout the years, is that even when we have high growth rates, it's highly concentrated. And not much of it is really going to the average Filipino, especially ng ating mga manggagawa. Kaya yung mga iba na pinagtatawanan lang yung mga manggagawa, mga kameta. Yung mga iba dyan sa, rally-rally kayo dyan, wala kayong mapapala dyan. Yung mga iba dyan na mahilig mag-cheer for the tycoons and the Karens and all of that. You don't know what you're talking about because ang laki ng contribution natin mga manggagawa, both sa labas at sa loob ng Pilipinas, sa whatever little growth we have. But the reason why we cannot make it more inclusive growth, mga kameta, is precisely because of the poor conditions, no? Poor conditions of an average Filipino worker. Kaya, wag natin sisisiin pag nag-rally yung iba dyan. Pakita ko lang ito, no? Para ma-compare nyo globally, no? So whatever we do is not only facts and data and service. We also do comparative analysis. We compare the Philippines to a lot of other comparable countries or at least some of our neighbors for you to have an idea. So ito yung global Gini coefficient. So the darker, that means lower yung level of income inequality, right? So you can clearly see that Europe, for instance, Japan, mga almost black color na sila. That means their inequality levels are way lower. They're in the Gini coefficient of 25 to 30. And then yung mga lighter colors, orange, ganun yung super unequal. And then you can see in the case of the Philippines, we're light purple. So we're in the 45 to 50 territory, which makes us very similar to a lot of Latin American countries like Colombia, like Bolivia, etc., or at least Argentina. But at least thankfully we're not as bad as Brazil, for instance, or is that Peru, for instance? Some of the Latin, but still compared to a lot of our Asian neighbors, tignan nyo, ang dark ng Indonesia, for instance, ang dark ng Japan, in terms of the color, and that means that they're doing very well in terms of distributing their wealth. Korea is too small, pero kung i-zoom nyo. So the lighter the color, the worse. And you can see the Philippines is among the lightest colors dun sa region. China, interestingly, is also very light color. But the thing with China, the different thing with China is that they're still creating high levels of growth and wealth. So even if it's not properly distributed, just like the Philippines, still there's so much still happening, right? That's why they lifted 600, 700 million people out of poverty. And yet in the Philippines, what's going on? Anyways, mga kamet, I hope hindi kayo na... I didn't do this to overwhelm you guys with data and numbers. I'm doing this, mga kameta, is because I want you to have a better appreciation of the actual reality of the Philippine political economy, an actual appreciation of who are the real heroes of the Philippine economy, and actual understanding of where we should improve things, um, and who really deserve more recognition, more respect, and more support from us. No, clearly not the Karens of this world, no, but the ordinary Filipinos, yung mga ating mga manggagawa who are doing a lot in helping our country and economy. Now, I wanted to make actually another lecture about, I want to add this, talk about, for instance, what are the more successful cases in pushing for more inclusive development and giving more rights to the workers. It looks like, by all accounts, the most successful case is actually Bolivia. But siguro next time na natin pag-usapan yan, I want to do some more podcasts also about the left. So if you look at it, the most successful countries in reducing the share of top 10%'s wealth compared to the poorer population, the most successful countries are Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. But Venezuela is still far away from Bolivia. So Bolivia actually is the most successful country when it comes to bringing down poverty and also creating more equitable growth. And yet, nadidemonize yung kanilang president because may pagka-socialist siya, no? So nire-red tag siya. But actual numbers are fascinating. In fact, these are articles by Western or American mainstream, no, that look at the success case of Bolivia. Poverty reduction almost halved over the past 2 decades. Growth rates maintained at 4 to 5%. Now, obviously, the Bolivia is not in best situation, but again, you have to look at it through long term. So this is an interesting quote. I got it from NPR, which is not a leftist. This is very much traditional American media. So according to World Bank and IMF, social and economic leaps in Bolivia made under Morales' leadership. The country's GDP grew at average of almost 5% from 2004 to 2017, while percent of the population living in extreme poverty was more than halved from approximately 36% to 70% during that time. So this is really impressive if you look at some of these numbers and all. I showed you another graph that showed the slashing also in the numbers of the super concentration of wealth in the top 10%. Anyway, there's more we can talk about, mga kameta. I know baka na-overwhelm kayo dyan. I don't want to do an over lecture here, but I'm just trying to say to you guys that when I say things, it's not because gusto ko si ganitong politiko or yung mga gusto ko ganyan. Mga kadiri yan. Ano yan? Doon na kayo sa mga trashy vloggers you want to do something like that. I'm here and everything I say is based on studies, research, data. I'm showing you the data. I'm giving you the sources. That's what we do here, mga kameta. And malay nyo, mga mamaya, pag meron na tayong na advertise ko pa tong drone na to. No, kung may drone na tayo mamaya, may pakita natin. Vlogger mode din tayo, no? Gawa tayo ng mga videos. No, but anyway, thank you so much also sa lahat ng mga sumusuporta sa atin, mga kameta. No, parang sabi ko, sarap i-drone ito, no? Yung mga talagang pakita natin, dami natin mga manggagawa na sumusulong, no? Na better working conditions and more security of tenure, etc. Kasi ang daming profits ng iba dyan eh. Tapos parating excuse nila, no, we cannot give you more of that. Pero yung pala, purong profit concentration ang nangyari dyan. And the sad thing is, despite all the big profits some people are making out there, they're not really producing much of new technology or anything like that. I was like, which is not impressive at all. As I said, we don't have a single global manufacturing brand. None. Of any note, right? Now, kudos to Jollibee, siguro, or I don't know, Tanduay or whatever. But those are not what I'm talking about when I talk about global manufacturing. Kaya VinFast of Vietnam comes closer to that, right? Anyway, mga kameta, mga manggagawang Pilipino, mga OFW, mga kaibigan natin all around the world. Thank you very much for all your support. through and through. At yung mga Bardagulan sa atin. Kasi akala siguro na yung ibang troll dyan. At yung mga vloggers dyan, feeling nila, ano, ah, ano akala nila, like, who do you think you're dealing with? No, di ba? Hindi nila alam na, ah, wag na, magpakabait na nga ako eh. Pakabait na ako. Pansinin naman sila. Kawawa naman. Di ba? Pinapansin nila kasi mga pictures ko ay napakit na mga ganyan, ganyan, ganyan eh. Alright. Thank you very much mga kameta. Thank you dito sa mga supporters natin. Yun, ang dami mga supporters natin dyan. Yan, yan. All of those working hard. Sabi ni Ma. Sabi ni Boy Kigol. Ano yung Bardagulan na? Walang ya. Ayan. Sabi ni... Sino? Chris Jobert. Late na ba ako sa Bardagulan? Wala, late ka na kasi wala naman talagang Bardagulan eh. Dito naman sa kabila, anong nangyari dyan? Pag-usapan natin yan. O, di ba? Na-surprise kayo. Nakakala naman dito ako, magwawala-wala ako. Yung pala, na lang yan. Bait and switch. At least, nagamit natin yan to get you guys to actually listen to something I think very interesting that I think is not as much appreciated by yung mga ibang vloggers dyan or mga experts dyan. Thank you very much also kay Ma'am Edno Lonan, kay Norgalin Dalmacio. Thank you very much also for kind support kay Luz Maya, Dankeschön. Thank you very much for joining us from Alemania, yan, Deutschland. Yan, marami tayong sa mga supporters dyan. Kay Ma'am Jocelyn Lumbero, of course, as always, thank you so much for support. Ayan, dami ng mga nagka-comment dyan. Kay Renz Milan Laron, kay Rosie Panes, kay Enrico Casalan. Sorry kung yung pagkano natin. Kay Aubrey, Heidi Calao, Kian Mark Dario, Jay De La Cruz, Christina Cabigao Nunez. Yan, Noemi Tablado, of course. Yan. Mamaya, thank you very much. Okay. Oh, catch up tayo again ha. Tingnan natin kung may mga Bardagulan naman, second edition, etc. Oh, wala nang Chester ha. Talagang takip na lahat. Wala nang Chester. Walang ya. Pinatulang pa yung mga Chester natin. Excuse me. Ano magagawa natin? At sorry, walang magulo. As coherent as my thoughts are, as you can see in my lectures, ganun din kaganda yung ating ano. Mag-push up na tayo. Thank you very much guys. Hindi magulo. Anyways, thank you very... Bakit kasi titignan yung ano natin, Chester natin? Walang, iba talaga tong mga to. Huwag na kasi patulan yung mga Chester. Di nga ako nagla-Latino style na ganun eh. What's up, Estados Unidos? Anyways, bukas, let's also catch up dun sa latest kay Marcos Jr. Sa kanyang trip. Tignan natin kung magsa-saxophone si Marcos Jr. Anong gagawin niya sa anong pangtapat niya kay President Yun. Lots to talk about mga kameta. So thank you very much again for your support. Danke schön. Off with the Zihen and talk to you soon.